Hello everybody and welcome again to chesslecture.com. This is International Master Dave Vigorito. Today I'm going to be doing something a little unusual for me. I'm going to be looking at some kind of basic endgame stuff. And I was inspired to do this by the recent match between Garry Kasparov and Nigel Short, which was won in a very pronounced fashion by Kasparov 8.5, 1.5. It could have been even worse because Kasparov lost one game on time in a better middle game, simply forgetting his clock. But one game that Short lost, he certainly could have drawn, and it just kind of followed some basic endgame principles. And I've actually I've shown this ending to some students who are really beginners, and they were able to figure out how to draw very quickly where Short failed. In fairness to Short, for all I know, he had 3 seconds on his clock, and just made a rash decision. But before we get to that, I'm just going to kind of look at this basic endgame that some of you may know, but some of you may not. And it's an endgame with a queen against a pawn on the 7th rank that is ready to queen. So for white to win, he, of course, cannot allow black to queen safely, and he has to win the pawn. There's a method to this. So the first thing to know is that the position is a win here. A lot of times, I think this was even pointed out by Dvoretsky, if you know a position is a win or a draw, you can sometimes head for it and then say, I'll have to figure it out when I get there. But it can certainly help you knowing certain endings like this. So this position is a win, and then the next thing you have to know is the method to do it. So the queen can't win by herself. The king will have to eventually come and help. But how do we bring the king up? Because black will always just keep threatening to queen the pawn. So what we have to do is force the black king in front of the pawn, and that will allow us to make progress. So here black is in check, he moves his king, and he's threatening to queen the pawn. So we have to keep checking. We can't check here, or black will just queen. So we check, and we keep coming closer. Now black doesn't want to block the pawn, so he'll just come here, check, check. And then this is kind of a key position to understand. If we keep checking, we're not going to get anywhere. But now that the king is separated from the pawn, we can just attack the pawn. And now the only move to save the pawn is to go here. And then we check. And now the king has to go in front of the pawn. And then we can bring the king up. And essentially, we do the same kind of mechanism over and over. Check. Keep trying to get closer. Then we make our quiet move. And then we can bring up the king. And so we can see that once we know the method, it's fairly easy. It's just a matter of taking the time to do it. So we see it actually takes several moves to win. Once our king is close, it becomes even easier. We can just check like this. And now we take the pawn. Next move, and we just mate very quickly, like this. So we see it takes quite a long time, but once you know how to do it, it's fairly simple to do. Now, if I go back and put the pawn on a different square, let's say like this position is also a win. We win just like we did before. We keep checking and bring the king up, and it's a win. But if we move the pawn to a different square yet again, like this, suddenly the position is a draw if it's a rook pawn, so an A pawn or an H pawn. And this is important to know. And the reason that it's a draw is because of a stalemate trick. So we make our quiet move, and we check. But now, if we bring our king up, it's stalemate, because there is no place for the black king to go. There's no I file. So there's actually just no way for white to make progress, and the position is a draw. And it's a fairly well-known draw. Now, I could also put the pawn on the C file or the F file, and again we have a draw. So let's say we bring up the king, king here, check. The king should actually go over here, check. And now black uses a different stalemate trick. He doesn't go here, because then the king will keep coming, but he goes here, and now if white takes the pawn, it's another stalemate. So what does this show us, okay? If black has a pawn on either center square, or the B or G file, so knight pawn, the position is a win for white. But if the pawn is a rook pawn or a bishop pawn, the position is a draw because of the stalemate trick. And maybe you won't get this kind of position so frequently, but it's something that every player should know. And a lot of times we can use this type of ending as like a very strong guidepost to make decisions in our games. And this brings me to Kasparov in short. So now I will get that position. So this position was reached in a game between Kasparov and Short in their match. And it's a little different. We see there's no queens, there's a rook on the board, there's some more pawns, but white is going this way, and black is, of course, going this way. So now black has to figure out if he can save the game. And in fact, the position, I think, is kind of an elementary draw. And after showing some real beginners, some children, the ending that I just went over with the queen against the bishop pawn, I found that beginners actually could figure out how to draw this in a fairly straightforward fashion. So a couple things we have to consider. If black can win the rook, which he could do right away like this, having a bishop pawn is enough to draw. But also if we queen this pawn and win the rook, having a rook pawn is a draw. So it seems like black has, should have some clear path to make a draw. But Short actually lost this game. So if you want here, you could take a minute to try to figure out the clearest way to draw. So if black queens right away, white has two choices that you can test yourself on. One is rook takes queen, and the other is to queen right away. So you should be able to figure out how to make a draw in either of these cases. If rook takes queen, king takes, white queens, and then c2. It's very important to have the pawn here. All these positions I've shown, notice that the pawn is already on the 7th rank, ready to be protected. If it's not, if we left it here and made some move like this, then the position is a win, because white will keep checking, get closer, there won't be any stalemate tricks, and white should even be able to get in front of the pawn eventually. It's really just a win. The pawn has to be on the 7th rank. But if black plays c2, it's just a draw. Now here white has various checks. He could check on h1, he could check on a8, or he could even just move his king, discover check, and then king here. And this position is such a well-known draw that I'm sure that Kasparov would not even try here. He would probably just extend his hand. It would just be a draw, because he knows that Short will know that this is a draw. Short's not going to forget about this stalemate trick. So that would draw. Now if we queen, and white queens, now it's a little different. And here black has to think of the best way to draw. So he has a few choices. He could push his pawn. He could give a check. He could take the rook. So there's a bunch of different options. So here you have to figure out what is, the easiest way to draw. Now, pushing the pawn just loses right away. White just moves his king anywhere, check, and just wins the queen with a skewer. And then it's over. White will be up a queen and a rook. If black checks, Instead, maybe he has a way to draw here, but I'm not sure. If white moves his king, black can keep checking. He might still be able to draw, because if a trade of queens, then c2. Probably, I would guess that this is also a draw, for a reason that I will get into in a second. The easiest way to draw is to simply take the rook. And the thing is, all right, if you check here, you can probably eventually work out a fork of the rook. Like, all right, if queen here, you just trade. If king up here, we can probably just keep checking. And as long as you can get this rook, you'll win. And I think white's not going to get away from the checks, because if he ever blocks with anything, then we'll take. But here you're looking for trouble, because maybe white will have some way where he can move up, something like this, and maybe find some kind of strange way to win, like maybe some position like this or something. But even this, I think, is holding. So, but we're looking for trouble by doing this, because we're still just trying to draw. It is much more simple to simply take the rook. Queen takes queen, and then c2. And again, we have our well-known draw. White cannot do anything. So this is how Short could have drawn the game. Really, queening is probably the most obvious move, the most straightforward move. But instead, he blundered. He did c2, and then queen. And now, again, if we go here, we just lose the queen to a skewer. So he queened this pawn. And, probably just in time scramble, he forgot that white does not have to take. If takes, takes, this is a draw, because we have the rook pawn, which is also a draw. But he does not have to take, and he actually just wins very easily. He could probably even just check here. That would win right away. If the king goes back, we just take the queen, and if here we skewer, so that's one way to win quite easily. But in the game, he did a different method. It's maybe not technically as good, but it all wins. So he just goes king here. So now if the king moves here, we skewer. If the king moves away, we simply take the queen. If the king goes here, we just take the queen. And now black has a rook pawn, but the queen just comes here right away and wins. So he blocked with the queen instead. And now if white trades queens, it's a draw again, the rook against the rook pawn. But he simply checks. And then king moves, and maybe something like queen b8 wins, but the easiest thing to do is to just trade here. And now black resigns. If takes, then we just take this, and it's over. So here we saw that, a former world championship contender, 2660 plus FIDE, overlooked an easy way to draw an ending that some school children might be able to draw. Again, I'm not trying to knock Short so much. He might have had 5 seconds on his clock or something. But we see how some basic knowledge can be important. Now, sometimes there's a weird trick that can be possible that I will show, something that I witnessed in person that was quite amusing. So I will set up this position now. Okay, this was a position that I saw in person in Chicago many years ago. Black is going this way, white is going this way. And this was a game between a Canadian international master, about 2400, Bluffstein, and black was a Ukrainian grandmaster, Igor Novikov, who's about 2600. And the position has been very sterile in drauge for some time. But I think here black's experience came through, because the position is really like a dead draw in a way. King b7, king c3, a7, b2, I'm sorry, a6, a7, b1 queen. And now, so we have the queen against a rook pawn. And I imagine that the player playing white just thought, well, it's just a book draw. It's a dead draw. I can do whatever. But there's actually one last trap in the position that's kind of hard to believe. White has to find the right way to draw. Right, of course, if he he's not going to come up here, and the queen would just go here and here. But should the king go to A8 to kind of self-stalemate, or go to the C file? Well, it turns out that he should just go to the C file, C7 or C8, and it's just a complete draw. Whatever he does, he can go here, he can go here. Well, I mean, white is threatening to queen if he does this just here, and we just have our draw like before, where there's just nothing to be done, and it would be a draw. But in the game, white, probably relaxing, just thinking everything is a draw, made a tragic mistake. He played king to A8. And this still looks like a draw, because, all right, white is stalemated, essentially. If we check here or here, the king simply goes back to B8, and it's a draw. But he left his guard down for one moment, and Novikov was aware of some small exception in this position. We all think of we know king versus king is a draw, and something like queen and king versus queen and king should be a draw, unless one queen is just hanging to an immediate tactic. But there are a couple exceptions, and this position is one. So black found this wonderful move, king b4. Now there's no stalemate. King b7, king c5, and here the young Canadian master started shaking his head and resigned. Okay, why did he resign? What's funny is in this position, it's hard to believe that this king is going to come get this king. They look so far away. But after this check, where can he go? All right, if he goes to c7, we just check and take the pawn. If, we can't go to a6 because it's just mate. If we go to a8, then we have the same trick. We go here, no stalemate, here, and then check. If king here, queen b7 is mate, and if here we also have mate, and we could win the pawn, but we just have mate right away. And if he goes to c8, this is where we have a position that's kind of an exception. The king can go here, attacking the pawn. If king b8, again, king c6 check. And if he queens, well, there's various ways to win, but let's say queen f5, and if here, then this is mate. And if king here, we can just skewer the queen. So we have this unusual position where the white queen is so badly placed that the white cannot defend. I've even seen positions where it's like white to move, and it's so badly placed. Like if his king was here, like I think, okay, here we have mate in one, but even like this move would win. This is the kind of position I've seen before, where it's white's move, but his queen can't do anything. The threat is queen c7 mate, queen e8 mate. So there's some exceptions. So I think just he relaxed a moment too soon, and black was aware that there's still some final tricks that can occur. So that's my coverage of this endgame of the queen against pawn on the 7th rank, and we see some positions are a win and some are a draw. And having that knowledge can help make the correct decisions in our games. So hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time on chesslecture.com.